Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 8th chapter in the book of Nehemiah. Herein we read of the overlay and interlap of two contemporary people, Nehemiah, the wall builder, the secular layman, and Ezra, the priest and reformer and revivalist, who were more or less contemporaries. Both of them have books which bear their names. A lot of the emphasis are slightly different. So Ezra is concerned with the rebuilding, reconstruction of the temple. Nehemiah is the walls, without which the temple would be reduced to smithereens. And they were both religious reformers. We do read Ezra perhaps more extensively than Nehemiah, although we do read in the 13th chapter that Nehemiah initiated several reforms of his own. But in the 7th chapter, we read kind of a lengthy list of names which may not mean a whole lot to us, but there was a great deal of emphasis in genealogies to the Jewish people. Remember, this is written to an originally Jewish audience, and Paul tells Timothy or Titus, or both of them perhaps, to not concern yourselves with genealogies because they are meaningless to the new covenant, which invites and embraces Gentiles. But the Jews did have to prove their lineage, and of course, once the temple that began to be reconstructed under Ezra was wiped out, then the Jewish lineages were forever lost in the smoke and ruins of that. And but they would have played an important role at some time. He lists the families, the clans, the people of certain towns, and not in that exact order, and different roles and functions that certain people played. So these names would have been significant to their immediate audience, but not so significant to us. You know, it seems almost unfair to call them footnotes because every human created by Elohim is precious in his sight, so we don't want to go too far. But we're just going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "And when the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities, and all the people gathered together as one man in the open space that was in front of the water gate. And they spoke to Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which Yahweh had commanded Israel." Now, the Israelite calendar was not, their months did not, some parts of them correspond to some of our months. This takes place in October, but not on the dot. The first date of it was actually October 2nd. The 7th month would have been a significant month in the Jewish calendar. So they celebrated the Festival of Trumpets on the first day of that month. The Day of Atonement was on day 10. That was the single most central and significant holiday in their calendar. And the Festival of Shelters, of which we're going to read more on as this discourse progresses, would have taken place from day 15 through 21. Each of these holidays had their own respective functions, and we'll elaborate more fully on what the Festival of Shelters means when we get there. But the Watergate, now waters were significant sources of vital nutrients without which ancient cities or the people in them could survive. So they were connected to a gate whereby which the water would have reached them and nourished them and filled them. And the law of Moses was something that they had fallen largely lapse on, and they were punished as a consequence of their repeated neglect or disobedience or waywardness to the law that was written in that book. So he's going to reread them, and it's going to be a fresh hearing for a lot of these people. "And Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of both men and women, and all who could hear with understanding, on the first day of the 7th month." This would have been the Festival of Trumpets, which corresponds to our calendar date of October 8th. And the audience gathered and assembled would have been people of mature enough understanding. It would have been men and women, but not so much children, because they lacked the discernment or the intuition or the comprehensive capabilities to really make sense of what he was about to read. And once more, we do have a chronologically precise dating, rather, when this event took place. And he read it from it in the open space in front of the water gate from morning until midday, before the men and women and all those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were on the book of the law. So this was what they were gathered for. This is what they were to hear. This is what Ezra was to speak. The book of the law, which would have been strange and unfamiliar territory to a lot of these people, who in a lot of ways had become lapse both before and during the exile. And Ezra the scribe took on a platform of wood, which they had made for the purpose, and beside him on his right stood Matthiah, and Shema, and Ananiah, and Uriah, and Hilkiah, and Messiah, and his left Pedaiah, and Mishael, and Malchiah, and Hashem, and Hashbaddanah, Zechariah, Meshullam. So we get an image of the physical setting of this scene. Ezra is in the center, and he's surrounded by these people who would have been significant to their own days, but are perhaps not so much historically significant as is he. But these people would have been people of positions of prominence and respect in the ecclesiastical community of the kingdom of priests, which Israel was called to be. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all people, for he was above all the people. And when he opened it, all the people stood up. So he was not only front and center, but he was also above them. He was at a higher platform. He would have been, a lot of pulpits are constructed to place the preacher above the audience. This was very much the occasion there. And as soon as he physically opened it, the people took their cue and stood up to listen to it. The people there, that would have been the men and the women of mature enough age to comprehend what he was about to unveil. And Ezra blessed Yahweh, the great Elohim, and then all the people answered, Amen, Amen, while lifting up their hands, and they bowed their heads and worshipped Yahweh with faces to the ground. So it all begins and ends with praise. It would be extremely rare and careless for a preacher not to, at least maybe not pray publicly, but to pray privately at the very least before saying what they're about to say. And the people follow his lead. They are stimulated into motions of obeisance and worship, and their faces are to the ground. This is symbolic of the abject humility, and the word humility is etymologically rooted in the Latin term for ground or earth. So they would have been humbled by their physical posture. And Joshua, and Bani, and Sherebiah, Yamin, Aquab, Shabbathai, Hodiah, Messiah, Quelita, Azariah, Yozabad, Hannah, Peliah, and the Levites caused the people to understand the Torah while the people were in their place. Now these names mean next to nothing to us. They would have been people of prominence, and they would have been functionally subordinate to Ezra. He would have told, they would have added illumination to enhance the comprehension of the audience from the straight words. We can imagine Ezra was just reading it start to finish, and the entire process, we'll soon read, took about 6 hours of the day. And the Levites were the tribe designated to the priestly function, so designated because Aaron and Moses hailed from there. They were descendants of Levi. And they read in the book of the law of Elohim, translating to give the sense, to give understanding to the reading. Now, since Moses had originally written this language, this book, the language would have evolved, and it would have not been so easily comprehended as it once was by its perhaps more immediate or original audience. So the reason we have translate, a lot of people don't like the King James, for example, because the thee and thou just confuse them. So we have to give new translations in order to give new meanings. And that language, the Old English language, is perhaps only spoken of when reading that Bible these days. So it's not, I personally don't, I actually like the aura of authenticity that the these, the thys, the thous give to the reading, but a lot of people in the audience might not like it as much as I do, so I try and stay away from that. And they read in the book of the law of Elohim, translating to give... Oh, I already read that. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest, the scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to the people, "This day is sacred to Yahweh your Elohim. Do not mourn or weep." For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. So Nehemiah was the secular governor. He was the one responsible for the reconstruction of the wall. Ezra would have been the priest, if not the high priest, certainly the leading one. And the Levites would have been the subordinate priest, and they would have maintained the utilitarian functions of the temple and the sacred worship precincts. And they're saying in unison that it is inappropriate to weep or mourn. And on this occasion, it was a sacred and solemn assembly. Now, there's no reason for Christians to mourn when they are forgiven any more than there is any reason for sinners being conquered by sin to rejoice. And Elohim gives us joy not in spite or instead of sorrow, but in the midst of sorrow. Then he said to them, "Go eat the fatness, drink the sweet, and send portions to those for whom none is prepared, for this day is sacred to our master. Do not be sad, for the joy of Yahweh is your strength." The joy of Yahweh is your strength. Now, there's a difference between happiness and joy. Happiness is fleeting. It can come through immediate gratification, but joy is something more permanent and abiding and longer lasting, at least as we've understand it and been taught and conditioned to understand it. But he's also telling them it's going to be a festival. Remember, this was the festival of trumpets. There would have been an element of eating on this sacred and solemn day, and he wanted them to be mindful of the poor in their midst who perhaps did not have the provisions of food, to go out of their ways to make sure that everyone assembled and everyone there would be fed and none would starve on this sacred day. And the Levites were silencing all the people, saying, "Hush, for the day is sacred. Do not be sad." So even after all this time, the Levites would have been necessary to quell the expressions of mourning that were in the midst and were not entirely appropriate for this occasion. Now, why might they mourn? They might mourn because the same word that wounds also heals. It brings a conviction, and maybe they weren't living their lives 100% as much as they would like to, or even as Yahweh would prefer. But the Levites are assuring them that it's not an occasion to mourn. It is an occasion to rejoice. This is a restoration. This is a sacred day. This is not your ordinary festival of trumpets day. This is a new beginning and a new lease on life in the the soon to be in the process of being restored promised land. And all the people went to eat and to drink and to send portions and make a great rejoicing, because they understood the words that were made known to them. And so the Levites, the translators, did an effective job. There was no hint or inference of anyone in the midst being bewildered or confused by the words that were being spoken by Ezra, at least as interpreted or applied or illuminated by these priests who were sent for that very purpose. And so there was not an iota of confusion about them. Now, they lived in a pre-printing press age, so not every ordinary citizen would have had a portable copy of the law. This would have been almost exclusively carried by rich people who could afford them, and more specifically the Levites and priests who absolutely needed them in order to do their job. And on the second day, the heads of the fathers of all the people, with the priests and Levites, were gathered to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. So on the second day, that would have been October 9th. And so this indicates a break of day. And having heard the word, they now are engaged in the process of studying it. And they needed the help and assistance of the priests and Levites and Ezra, who were Ezra was especially the expert on the law, and because they once more did not, they probably were, a lot of them in all likelihood were hearing it for the first time, and it probably stung their hearts to know what they were called to do as Jews. And they found written in the law, which Yahweh had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths in the festival of the 7th month. So this festival is the festival of shelters. This once the nation of Israel became a settled nation in fixed stationary locations. They were commanded on yearly occasions to remind themselves of what their ancestors endured during the Exodus. They were sheltered, but they were technically homeless. They did not have a permanent or stationary location of residence. They were constantly on the move, and so they would have been dependent on tents in order to get from A to B without perishing on the way to C. And they should announce and proclaim in all their cities in Jerusalem, saying, Go out to the mountains, and bring olive branches, branches of olive trees, and myrtle branches, and palm branches, and branches of the leafy trees, to make booths, as it was written. Now the instructions for the proper observance and protocol of this day would have been outlined somewhere in Deuteronomy, so every item listed would have been of symbolic significance to this day, and it would have collectively and individually served to remind them of where they came from and where they were at now. So the people went out and brought them and made themselves booths, each one on the roof of his house, and in the courtyards, and in the courtyards of the house of Elohim, and in the open space of the water gate, and in the open space of the gate of Ephraim. So these are where they made the tents and the... now, typically they would have done this on top of the roofs, at least during the monarchical period. This practice may have lapsed while they were in Babylonian captivity because, just for 1,000,001 reasons, the Babylonians might not have been as tolerant as other of the conquerors that subsumed Judah would have been. But it's here and now, and it's restored, and it's going forward, and it's in motion, and they are obeying to the letter the law of Moses as instructed, as dictated to Moses through the mouth of Yahweh. Moses spoke to Yahweh as a man does to a friend, mouth to mouth, face to face. So these were not strictly speaking his words, although he was the spokesman of them. And the entire assembly of those who had come back from the captivity made booths and sat under the booths. For since the day of Joshua, son of Nun, until the day of the children of Israel had not done so, and there were very great rejoicing. So the nation hadn't seen anything like this, at least since Joshua, who was the leader when they became a nation and settled in the promised land. There had never been anything like it in term as measured by the measure of rejoicing and the extent thereof. And remember, they had just came and returned recently from the captivity in Babylon to make these booths and to observe this practice. And day by day, from the first day until the last day, he read from the book of the law of Elohim, and they performed the festival 7 days. And on the 8th day there was an assembly, according to the just judgment. So this would have been a 7-day feast. Remember earlier we mentioned that it lasts from the 15th day of the month, October 9th to us, to the 21st, which, however... many numbers, I guess that would have been the 16th in our calendar. So it was a 7-day, it was a annual weekly reminder of their origins and what their ancestors had to do in order to give them the inheritance that they can now claim. And in the opening verse of the 9th chapter, we read of the 24th day of this month. This would have taken us to October 31st. So once more, the Hebrew calendar and our calendar is not geometrically aligned. They might have, I don't know if they had 10 or 12 months, but interesting story. The word October was originally the 8th month of the year. It was so named in reference to Octavian Caesar, as is the month of July, to his adopted, the father who adopted him. He was his great uncle biologically, Julius Caesar. That was so named for July, but for reasons that are neither known to us nor especially relevant to you, the 8th day of the month became the 10th in the passage of time. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.